This is Mary Page from Chicago, and welcome to the Rights in Russia interview on human rights in the Russian Federation. Today, our guest is Rachel Denber, Deputy Director of for Europe and Central Asia at Human Rights Watch. She has done field research and advocacy in Russia and former Soviet Union countries, and earlier directed HRW's Moscow office. Thank you for joining us, Rachel, and sharing your perspectives on the situation for present-day human rights defenders in Russia. I have some questions I'd like to pose with a view to trying to understand just what's going on in Russia right now, and want to do this all in about 30 minutes. So let's get started with my first question, which is the human rights situation in Russia as bleak as the Western media tend to suggest?
That's a good question. Look, there has been a concerted effort by the Russian government in recent years to tighten the screws, to limit free speech, to tarnish human rights organizations, to tarnish human rights defenders, and as foreign agents and as undesirable organizations and the like. So there has been, on the one hand, this constant and escalating pressure from the authorities to limit speech, to limit public criticism, to limit public calls for any kind of policy change, and to contain and stop demonstrations, or to contain or stop in some aspects critical speech. So on the one hand, you have all of this going on, and it is definitely escalating. On the other hand, the situation is more textured and more complicated than the way we read about it in the Western media, because the Western media is reporting on the news, and these measures that the Kremlin takes are obviously newsworthy because they're in some ways they're shocking, and they're bad, and they're wrong, and they're abusive. On the other hand, there's a lot of work, human rights work. There's a lot of ferment. There is a lot of public activity that happens beneath all, despite all of these Kremlin efforts to contain civil society and to contain grievances. So it's a lot more complicated than the Western media, I think, has the space to project. And I think it really depends on who you are, to what degree these measures by the Kremlin affect your lives really depends on a combination of things, like who you are and also just bad luck, right? So I don't think the Kremlin's aim is to recreate 1937, or even though the new laws that are being adopted are repressive and they're abusive, and the laws to limit NGOs and to limit public engagement some of them do have criminal penalties. I don't, though, think that the aim is to lock up thousands and thousands of people in Russia. I think the aim is to adopt these laws, apply them both in a demonstrative way to certain individuals, and also in an arbitrary way, to send a very chilling message to people. So I think that Russia's brand of authoritarianism is one that seeks to be efficient by sending strong enough messages and arbitrary messages and demonstrative messages, but without locking up hundreds or thousands of people. So it really depends on who you are. So if you're somebody who wants to be involved in creating change, if you were unhappy with the social policies and you took to the street to get involved in a public protest that wasn't authorized, you put yourself at risk. Depends on what kind of public protest it is. With some public protests, as we see, the authorities cracked down very hard, and there was no tolerance whatsoever. For example, the protests this past January that protested about the treatment of Alexei Navalny. There was just zero tolerance for those. Other public protests, well, it kind of depends on what the nature of the protest is and who they target, where they are, whether they're in a big city or in a provincial city, what the mood of public officials is. So on the one hand, there is the potential to pay the price with your freedom, with your liberty, or for just going out on the street and objecting to a trash dump that's being built in your neighborhood, or COVID policies, or poor public health facilities. You run a risk, but you run a much higher risk if you're going to protest something that is the really sore spot for the Kremlin. So it's textured, it's layered. Also, it depends on, also on the lines of who you are. Are you someone who is going to challenge what happened to you personally? Are you litigious? Do you want to press charges? If you were abused by the police, do you want to press charges against the police? Well, you can probably expect a lot of headache for that, and potential like retaliation. Again, along the lines of who you are. If you have, if you are a Jehovah's Witness, for example, you can expect to be on the radar screen of the authorities. You can expect to have your house raided. You could expect maybe even to go to jail. So it really depends on who you are, to what degree your beliefs or your sense of grievance rub against either the local authorities or the central authorities.
So to what extent can human rights organizations still function and be effective in this kind of climate?
Well, I want to say a little bit more about how it is that the government's trying to make it impossible for them to function. I mean, because the authorities really are trying to crack down on human rights groups and journalists to put every possible barrier in the way to prevent them from being a conduit for public grievances or being a conduit for resolution of grievance. The foreign agents legislation that was introduced, there are a number of tools in the arsenal. One of those tools was the foreign agents legislation that was introduced in 2012, which has only gotten more severe as the years have gone on. And the most severe iteration of that happened in this autumn, in November and December, and there's a new amendments to the foreign agents law that actually makes it possible for the government to designate individuals as foreign agents. Anybody who has an opinion, who goes online, shares that opinion, if they are in any way connected to any kind of money from abroad, no matter how remote that connection might be, you can be designated as a foreign agent with all of the consequences, both for failure to abide by the foreign agent's law and register and file reports and the like, right up to administrative responsibility and criminal responsibility, right? And so those are pretty, it's a very wide-ranging, vague law that is trying to paint people with this toxic label, to demonize them and to marginalize them. And I think ultimately to make the public not only be skeptical about human rights organizations, but to actually fear them. Well, the question is this campaign successful? But I think we need to see how remarkably human rights groups have been fighting back for their space, and fighting for their ability to protect and represent people's interests. And I think they've done that with remarkable resilience by challenging the foreign agent label in court, by finding ways around it. And I think because because Russian groups have been so good at finding ways around it, that's why actually I think that's why the authorities have introduced this newest iteration of the foreign agents amendments to close all of the loopholes. But I think even despite all of that, I think that human rights groups have been effective and at various levels. They've been effective in litigation. They've been effective in getting justice at the European Court of Human Rights. We've seen also some successful cases in litigation for again, for torture against prisoners in Russian courts. I think that we've seen, for example, women's groups be very successful at raising, not only raising concern about domestic violence, but also at changing public opinion about domestic violence. So I mean, I think that Russian groups are fighting back. I think that they still can be effective. I think where it's really hard to be effective is engaging in like open dialogue with the authorities. They are obviously, especially with the foreign agents law, it's just a lot less dialogue, meeting, conversations happening between human rights groups and the authorities.
You mentioned women's groups, and I'm wondering how much community support, sort of generally, do human rights organizations have, or is this dependent on exactly kind of what they're doing?
I think it depends on what they're doing. Look, I think that there tends to be a caricature of Russian society and the relationships to human rights groups, and the caricature is that everyone believes that that human rights groups are all backed by nefarious foreign interests that wish Russia ill. I think that is a caricature. I think it might be the case for some people, but I think that different human rights groups have communities that they serve and that believe in them. So the women's groups that work on issues of domestic violence, other gender-based violence, they have a community of domestic violence survivors that believe in them and that want more from their government. So, and I think that they've been very successful. You have communities of people, the community of LGBT people, I think feel very strongly about the remarkable groups in Russia that are standing up for the LGBT people to be seen, just to be seen as equals in Russian society, which they are not. I mean, no matter how much Putin likes to say that that there's no discrimination against LGBT people, when you have a law that says that promoting relationships about that are not traditional is banned vis-a-vis children, I'm sorry, that's discrimination. That's treating people as as second-class citizens. So I believe that those organizations have a community, have their communities of support of supporters, and other groups that serve other communities also have the groups of supporters. Let's remember that there are human rights groups that work with people with disabilities that I think that also have their communities of supporters and people who need them. There are human rights groups that protect health, that protect public health. So I mean, I think that we should not paint with one broad brush this notion that people in Russia are suspicious of human rights groups because the government tells them they have to be.
What kind of risks do human rights defenders face in Russia today? What are the risks they're taking to
yeah, well, it depends on the issue. It depends on the issues that they work on. One level of risk is just getting on the nerves of local officials. If you're a human rights group that does more, that provides services, that's great, right? But some groups that provide services also want to change the problem that is making their services necessary. So, for example, if there was an example of a couple of years ago of a group that provided information to people with diabetes, right? And it was an NGO. I believe they got some. I think they got some foreign funding. I don't know, but they wanted to do more than just, you know, provide a service. They wanted I think there was an insulin shortage, and they wanted to they, you know, wanted to stop this blockage or make, or, you know, provide more information about the insulin shortage and find out what was going wrong, and correct it. And that rankled local officials, and then this NGO got tagged as a foreign agent. So what do they risk? You know, you risk, if you get tagged, if you get registered as a foreign agent and you don't comply with the law, you know, you risk big fines. And if you maliciously violate the law, then you actually, you know, you risk prison. There's a human rights defender in Sochi right now fighting off Semyon Simonov, who's now fighting off a pretty serious case against him for not complying with foreign agents law. So you risk harassment, you risk marginalization, you risk prison, especially you know, if you're working on an issue that, like I said, rankles or touches the economic interests of local officials, like some of these projects in the having to do with waste disposal that we saw a couple of years ago in various regions. There's a lot of money in waste disposal, right? So the people who led protests about these issues, you know, found themselves at risk of going to prison for leading unauthorized public demonstrations. But, you know, the thing is that this mobilization of public grievance about these trash projects in a couple of places were successful. You know, the project in Arkhangelsk, in the Shias, you know, in the woods near the Shias railway station, that project has now been suspended. It was a massive project that was going to, for which they had already cleared, you know, acres and acres of forest, and they were going to, you know, put this, you know, garbage dump and waste processing site right in the middle of a forest, and local people were quite upset about it, and there were sustained protests about it, and eventually the government backed off. You know, it was a government project. The government backed off, but the activists, the environmental activists and the grassroots activists that put themselves on the line for it, they have criminal records now. Mm-hmm. So they're still paying the price.
Mm-hmm. And are there sources of psychological support for these defenders that take such risks?
Mary, that is a really important question, and I'm really glad you asked it, because another risk that people take is, they risk their lives, they risk being marginalized, and they also risk their health. A lot of the people whom human rights defenders in Russia are supporting are people who have been deeply traumatized, and dealing and helping, working with people who are traumatized has a big risk of traumatizing you as well. And constantly, when you combine that with constantly being under government scrutiny, constantly being demonized, constantly being yelled at that you're a foreign agent, that you're a spy, that you're a piece of trash, constantly having to fight in court. I mean, that takes a big toll on your soul. So I think that and it's important to address that. I think a lot of, there's no way that you deal with trauma and without it somehow affecting you as well. There are resources out there. I know that there are, especially the donors are making these resources available and making funding available for groups to deal with trauma. It's one thing to make the resources available. It's the other thing to persuade human rights defenders to use those resources, and to really, it's another thing also to find the services that can help human rights groups deal with trauma and related issues and do it the right way. I think it's very complicated.
So looking kind of at the broader picture, is it possible to say what kind of impact US or EU foreign policies might have for human rights in Russia?
Mary, you ask very complicated questions, and that's another complicated one. What impact can they have on human rights? Well, look, I mean, maybe three, I want to make 3 points. One point is the US and the EU have made human rights and, you know, a feature of their, in certain ways, of their Russia policies. So they support human rights communities, they support human rights values, they do it at a bilateral level, they do it through supporting human rights defenders, and they do it also in multilateral fora. And that is very important. The degree to which that changes Russia's policies, that's a complicated and non-linear process. So just because the West, you know, the Western governments say, look, you need to release X, Y person, or you need to, you know, this law is bad, it's not necessarily going to lead, obviously, immediately to the release of you know, ex-political prisoner or the annulment of a repressive law. But at the same time, you know, this is already the policy of the U.S. and the EU, is with a, you know, I guess with the exception of, you know, the 4 years of under the Trump administration, and I think that they need to I think that they need to continue to make human rights continue to make human rights a priority. Stepping back would be a disaster. I think if the US or the EU were to suddenly drop human rights from their priorities with Russia, that would be a signal that, see, it would be a signal from the Kremlin would interpret that as a signal to society that, see, no one really cares. They're all cynical anyway. And they don't care, it's all politicized, and then you know, there would be no voice really to protect the human rights defenders and journalists and the like in Russia today.
I'd just like to go back a minute talking about these sources of emotional and psychological support, and ask whether the shows of support from, say, counterparts in other countries is good for human rights defenders, or does it tar them under the foreign agent laws and restrictions? How is that played?
Well, there are two answers to that question. One is, I think we should let human rights defenders decide for themselves what they want, give them some agency, right? Too often, quite often we get the question, for example, from governments, you know, when we encourage leaders to make sure that they meet with human rights defenders when they go to Russia, they often say, well, won't that just hurt them? Shouldn't we really just stay away? And my answer almost always is, give them agency over it. Let them decide for themselves. The other answer to your question is that these are universal values. And I think that we need to act on that. And we need to make sure that we don't let ourselves become prisoner to a paradigm that the Kremlin is trying to set out for us.
Right. Good point. So, in conclusion, in your view, what does the future hold for human rights in Russia?
I think it's going to be a struggle. You know, I think that the Kremlin is. I think that we'll probably see more of the same. I think we'll see more of the same, more turning, you know, tightening of the screws, more not less repressive legislation. I think that we'll continue to see, you know, both arbitrary and demonstrative crackdowns. I think it will ebb and flow depending on what difficult moments the Kremlin sees ahead of it. And right now, the difficult moment, the signature moment is going to be the September Duma elections. Like any election cycle is like a crisis for the Kremlin. They treat it like a crisis. So I think that I think we will continue to see some pretty serious crackdown in the lead up to the September Duma elections. So I think we have to continue. We have to not let up. We have to support and listen to our partners, and also act responsibly.
Thank you so much for making time for this conversation and sharing your expertise. And we appreciate it very much.
It was my pleasure, Mary. Have a nice day.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.